Welcome back, everyone. I'm Nicholas Boyd, aka LOaF Ninja, and today we're going to be talking about thumbnail drawings. Right here in front of me, we have a series of mostly portrait, small thumbnail drawings with one landscape. They're all focusing on one set of objects, but multiple compositions. The idea behind thumbnail drawings is to rapidly explore compositional arrangements before you dive into the final. That initial idea isn't always the best idea. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you come back to it and you're completely happy with it. You're satisfied that was the one. But most of the time you end up, as you're exploring these different options, you find different ways to arrange them that you never really had thought of the first go around. Sometimes it makes you become more creative. So you start thinking, well, okay, well that shape doesn't quite work very well, so let me throw in something else. And then maybe, oh, this made me think of a slightly different twist on the narrative, so let me work that in and see how that goes. So you end up doing a whole bunch of different options here. In this series that we have in front of you, we have the skeletal remains of probably a deer. I haven't quite figured that part out yet. A bat and some sort of toxic flower, all focusing on pollinators and the importance of pollinators in our society to create that kind of symbiosis, right? So my first one is here on the left, right? I just have kind of centralized but secondary information kind of drawing you back around. The next one, I took it a little bit further, fleshed it out, thought about hanging the bat from the inside, thinking about the rule of thirds. This one I cropped in a little bit more because the perspective is really off on here. This would have to be kind of up on top of some sort of elevated ground in the back. So I was cropped in a little bit more to put a bit more emphasis on the bat. And the next one I explored the landscape aspect ratio, wider than it is tall. I haven't really finished this one yet. I'll come back to it at some point. That's kind of where I left off. Today we're going to be going through the same process, just using different objects, these here that you see in front of you. I'm going to explore, portrait and landscape and just kind of see where it takes me. In full disclosure, I do have a printout printed and taped up on the window behind this setup because I took a photo from a little bit lower orientation point, or I guess you say vantage point, because right now the way I'm looking down on it, I'm seeing too much of the top, the opening of the skull, and it's making the skull look a little wonky. So I got a little bit more eye level, just drop down ever so slightly to make that a bit more appealing. So when you start out any sort of thumbnail drawing, you need to be thinking about that aspect ratio. Do you want this thing to be taller than it is wide? Or do you want it to be wider than it is tall? Do you want it to be square? Explore all of these. It could be circular. Think about that composition starting out. I tend to gravitate a little bit more towards the portrait than I do any of the other ones. Sometimes square. Landscape is on the rarer side for me. I need to mix that up. I need to break that habit. So right now, we're not going to jump into full detail or anything, right? We're just going to go into, okay, where do these elements fall within the composition? Basic kind of shapes. You can go really basic with them, as I just did here. A lot of times it's kind of a good way to go about it, so you're not investing way too much time into these thumbnail drawings, because again, that's the whole point of these, is to rapidly explore composition before you dive into all that detail work, right? You don't want to flesh something out and then realize you just wasted hours or days on something that just in the end it doesn't look good because the composition is garbage. So again, I can do this. I'm exaggerating some of these proportions and whatnot, and I'm kind of moving them around to see where they might fall. While I'm doing this, I'm thinking about the rule of thirds. And if you've ever used a camera phone, you've probably been exposed to these little grid lines. They're not always defaulted to be on the camera, but they used to be. I recommend leaving them on because they are a reminder, hey, composition, you know, think about that. So what they do is divide your composition up into thirds, both horizontally and vertically. And what you want to do is to place your subject matter in some of these quadrants, whether if it's just one object, focus it in the main dominant area of that subject matter within one of these quadrants. Multiple objects, put the main dominant area within both, you know, two different generally opposing corners of the composition. What that does is it creates asymmetrical balance. Rather than me being centered here, it moves me, you know, down here. And that asymmetrical balance is usually a bit more appealing. It opens up a bit more movement through the composition rather than being stagnant right in the center. And so when you first are doing these thumbnail drawings, they're not always going to be aligned perfectly to the rule of thirds, but you know, keep that in mind while you're going about it, and you can just tweak it as you go. Again, square. Squared composition. That's kind of nice. It forces everything in a bit more, gives you a bit more of a interesting negative space, right? Whereas all the other ones are a bit more open, a bit more negative space than maybe I would like. But I might actually I'm going to go with this one and just tweak it a little bit. You can always move things around as well, you know, like regardless of how they're set up in front of you, you can always take that and in your drawings, shift it. Sorry, I keep looking back at my phone to make sure this isn't cutting off like it was a while ago. So do another portrait. Maybe it's not quite as tall, but the same width, you know? So it's a little bit closer to square. I like this coming down through here. This guy here. This guy here. So now I can come in and go, okay, well, what does that shape really look like of the shape of each of these objects? What do they really look like? I'm actually changing the shape of this leaf a little bit just to give it a bit more of this kind of curve through here, right? So this is coming down. This is kind of like a fold of the leaf, top edge, curving back around. This would be that center vein of the stem, and then all of the other little veins coming through. This here would be that top kind of area, I guess that tapered detail. This tapers down to here, and then this guy So that would be my basic composition. Thinking about also, I have the lighting. It's being backlit. It's also being lit from this way. So I have kind of this dominant shadow coming in this way off of this guy. Same thing coming in off of this guy. But it's going to be broken up, so I'm going to have a bit of a shadow going off that way as well, but nothing major. It's going to be diffusing the edges of those cast shadows. I'm just kind of blocking some of these values here. Just to make it a bit easier to see. And usually it's as a reminder to, I guess where these values were and how they fell across the objects, right? Generally, don't really work in a whole lot of value when you're doing thumbnail drawings. Because again, remember, you don't want to spend too much time. But value is very important for composition. It can really balance out your elements, right? So it's important to at least block in some of those details. So it's really kind of high contrast up here. This edge of the cactus. So that's that main composition I'll probably be going with. Things will tweak. Obviously, shape and proportion is not exact yet, but that looks pretty nice. I have my main focal point here on the cactus. It's going to be kind of this texture and lighting here, and then also the smaller secondary of the skull is going to be within that other quadrant of the rule of thirds. And then that tertiary information, which is kind of back here, this leaf, it's also kind of creating a little bit of movement. If I wanted to reinforce that movement, I would put something else back here, drawing you back up and around. So, I mean, that's something I can add in. Now that I'm thinking about it, maybe it's a back edge of the table that really doesn't look like this, but maybe it's coming in at an angle like this and coming off the backside here, and then I would end up adding some sort of gradient back here. To kind of create a little more contrast. And obviously this will look definitely better as I work through it with graphite, get in some details and so forth. And depending on what you're going for, usually when you're doing still lifes, you're thinking about, you want these to be representational generally. So what that means is you want to make them as real as possible, right? And in real life, we don't have contour lines, hard contour lines around us, right? We're seeing value. You know, there's not, what's creating this contour is what we call implied line, which we'll get into later. But that implied line is just value of the surrounding space and the, you know, say the negative space and the positive shape just meeting. And there's some sort of either diffused or crisp edge or whatnot, but that value is falling off in some way. And that's what's defining that contour, rather than just defining it with a hard edge, which, you know, if you're doing a study that where the end result is going to be illustrative in nature, then yeah, you want to practice your illustrative techniques, and you know what kind of line work you want to inject into that rendering. But if you're just trying to hone your skills as far as rendering goes and creating realism, then you need to, you know, practice working in detail, lighting and whatnot, and using implied line instead of a hard contour line. Obviously, you know, for the sake of this drawing, this thumbnail, it's just a thumbnail, so you can have a little bit of actual line in there to help define some spaces, some shapes and whatnot. But notice now how just blacking out this background here. I'd probably put another, I already covered it up, but I'd put a little bit of a rim lighting here to make that back side of the cactus pop a little bit more. But notice how this is creating contrast. Now that I blacked this out against this white ground plane, you know, I can add some texture on here. This is actually sitting on a marble slab, so I can work a little bit of that texture into there. I can work in some more of those gradients from the lighting. But again, this is drawing you up and around, and this is pushing you back towards the planter. And then the planter's vertical, drawing you back down. And I'm getting this movement through the composition. There's a little bit of a rhythm to it, kind of sharp angles, but again, this is this secondary and tertiary information within the background, and this leaf that's going to be kind of out of focus is reinforcing it and bringing you back around, and that's what you want. You want a lot of movement generally in your compositions. So sometime later, you know, I'll probably flesh this out at a little bit larger scale, 4x6 or 5x7, and I'll do that with graphite, and I will go over my technique and my process and thought behind all of the decisions that I'm making, you know, why I'm starting this way, why I'm using this tool, and so forth. But hopefully, you know, you guys found that helpful. I will end on by showing this, bringing this up a little bit closer. I don't know if you can see all of that, and I will take a photo. But yeah, hopefully you found this helpful. Thank you.